To speak about the causes of the War of 1812, we should look at the historical background. Russia and France were two superpowers of that time. The population of the two empires almost reached 40 million people. Well, for example, Austria had some 20 million residents. Thus, Russia and France were the world's most powerful countries with the most powerful armies. When Napoleon took the helm in 1799, his main goal and hope was a union with Russia. He turned to Russia's Emperor Paul I with this idea and saw understanding. In late 1800, early 1801, the formation of the Russian-French Union was almost over, as Paul I also realized the immense geopolitical benefit of cooperation. If the countries had found common language on the global arena without interfering in domestic affairs of other countries, they would have dominated Europe and shaped the global policy. They would have also been able to control Great Britain's trade and expansion interests. In March 1803, Paul I was assassinated in a court conspiracy. His son, Alexander I, who was only 23, completely changed Russia's policy right after accessing the throne. In the first year of his reign, he was not engaged in foreign policy that much, but beginning with late 1802, he became preoccupied with foreign affairs. He made a U-turn in Russia's external policy and went into confrontation with France. It seems logical to us as we know the history of the 1812 war. Napoleon looked like a madman, obsessed with conquering Russia, but it was not that obvious at that time. Napoleon never planned to conquer Russia. Moreover, his political strategy up to 1810 was to establish a union with the Russian Empire, to reach bilateral interaction by all means. So why, beginning from 1802, Alexander started to pursue an anti-French and anti-Napoleon policy? Well, some say it was caused by Napoleon's European expansion. Well, yes, Napoleon Bonaparte, being a young consul, he was 32, 33 at that time, energetic and talented, naturally aspired to expand the French borders. But this expansion by no means threatened Russia, either its borders or its interests. Russian-French geopolitical interests had practically no crossing points. By the way, Napoleon's expansion was children's play compared to British colonies. And this evidence is based on thousands of documents of that time, not on post-1812 sources. So I see no other explanation except personal dislike and jealousy Alexander felt towards Napoleon. This also perfectly explains further steps made by Alexander in his external policy. The emperor suddenly became an Anglophile and began to support the Englishmen, so that in 1803 the British breached the peace treaty of Amiens and English-French hostilities resumed. If Alexander had stayed neutral in the emerging English-French conflict, England would not have dared to launch the war. But Alexander expressed his support, and so Great Britain made a decision to fight as Napoleon was its rival #1 on the global arena. Before Napoleonic France, there was no developed capitalist country that could compete with Great Britain. The Great French Revolution resulted in the emergence of a new France, with developed science, technology and industry. So, what Britain mostly wanted was to remove this dangerous competitor, and thus the Anglo-French War began. England dominated the sea, while France dominated the land, which made Napoleon look for further expansion in Europe to control navy bases and secure support against the British Empire. In 1805, Alexander I began to form the Third Coalition against France. It would have never been possible without him, because Austria and Prussia were ready to sign military agreements or a convention with Russia, but of a purely defensive nature. You see, nobody wanted to attack Bonaparte, but Alexander I managed to pull Austria, Sweden and the Kingdom of Naples into the coalition by putting pressure on it and Prussia, and with the help of British money. And so the 1805 War of the Third Coalition began. It ended on December 2nd, 1805, in a bloody defeat in the Battle of Austerlitz, where Napoleon crushed Russo-Austrian troops. Austria immediately accepted peace, while Alexander had to retreat from Central Europe. But not only was he dissatisfied, he actually began to lure Prussia into a new coalition. In 1806 he managed to form a new Fourth Coalition. This time Prussia attacked Napoleon and was totally destroyed in a 2-week campaign. But it was not enough for Alexander I. He pulled all powers of the empire together and waged the 1807 War of the Fourth Coalition on the territory of former Rzeczpospolita, East, the Polish state, and West Prussia. It ended on June 14, 1807, with the Russian army crushed at Friedland. Alexander had to make peace with Napoleon and Tilsit on the 7th and 9th of July 1807. Another total defeat. But why? Why all the 1805-1807 wars? What for? The majority of Russian nobility, among them Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, stood for an independent external policy. They thought that Russia had no need to get into European brawls, as it had problems of its own, like, for example, issues with Turkey, that was the major geopolitical trouble in the south of Russia, or the liberation of the Balkans peoples. So Russia had more important things to do than fight against France. Kutuzov voiced this idea in 1805 and after. Alexander I hated Kutuzov. He detested him the same as he detested Napoleon, which is quite a paradox, isn't it, taking into account that these were the two 1812 rivaling commanders. Because Kutuzov kept saying that Russia didn't need these wars. In 1807, Alexander was forced to sign a peace treaty. He smiled at Napoleon, and the emperor called Alexander I his friend, thinking that his expectations to conclude a union with Russia had finally come true. However, in 1807 things became more complicated than in 1801-1803. Russia had 2 military defeats, and the nobility and military men were beginning to think of a revenge, which is quite natural. But what was worse was that the wars brought Napoleonic troops close to Russian borders, as Poland was carved up into the 3 parts in the late 18th century, divided between Russia, Prussia and Austria. So there was no Polish state. When Napoleon was chasing the defeated Prussian troops, he entered the Prussian part of Poland and saw an enthusiastic uprising of local Poles, who met the French as liberators and freedom bringers after years of humiliation. The Peace of Tilsit gave a new dimension to the Polish problem. A small Polish duchy had become a real cornerstone in the Russian-French relations. Liberating Poland was unacceptable for Russian nobility, many of whom were granted lands on the Polish territories. So the Polish issue was always painful for Russian nobility. Napoleon, in his aspiration to defeat Great Britain, decided to impose a continental blockade in 1806. After Russia joined a temporary union with Napoleon in 1807, some Russian noblemen couldn't export their grain to England anymore. It covered a number of traders, but not all of them. Thus, the Polish issue and the continental blockade of England triggered revanchist moves in the Russian society and made some people desire a war against Napoleon. Beginning from 1808, Alexander I dropped the union with Napoleon. In 1810, when the French emperor felt that the union was falling apart, he made his last call. He asks Alexander's permission to marry his sister. Today people speak about Alexander I declining the offer as nothing unexpected, but it was actually an extraordinary decision at that time. You see, dynastic marriages were rather significant back then. If Alexander's sister Anna had married the French emperor, the latter would have never attacked Russia. For him, family ties had a great say. So, you see, Russian Grand Duchess becoming the empress of the then second greatest empire after Russia was more than a Russian girl entering the emperor's bedroom. It meant a vast Russian lobby at the French court, top military men, diplomats, etc. Just imagine, Poles who lived in Paris were petrified with this idea, understanding that the marriage would mean the end of Poland. And this would have made Russia and France inseparable allies, and no war between them would have happened. But Alexander refused, which suggests that he desired a war. He was perfectly aware that this would spoil relations. Austria reacted immediately, offering Napoleon to marry an Austrian princess. And you know, after that marriage, all previous conflicts were forgotten. By 1810, Napoleonic victories and dynastic marriages led to a single federative Europe, controlled by the French emperor. Austria and West Germany and northern Italy became Napoleon's close allies. Napoleon became a new Charles the Great with his new European empire. And then he realized that there would be no union with Alexander I, and both parties began to get ready for a clash. In 1810, Russia enjoyed a number of victories in Turkey, and everybody expected the campaign to end in 1811, with an entrance into Constantinople and the end of the dispute. But what did Alexander do? He removed 5 divisions of the 9 present at the front, which is 60,000 people, and deployed them at the border with the Warsaw Duchy. The only explanation is an attack on the Duchy. In spring 1811, Warsaw was in panic evacuating archives and arsenals, preparing for the Russian invasion. This small, newly liberated part of Poland was getting ready to fight till the bitter end. Napoleon was flooded with reports about an inevitable intrusion, but he kept denying the fact until he found out about the Russian divisions at the border. Prince Poniatowski, commander of the Polish troops, came to Paris almost standing on his knees, begging Napoleon for help. Under the pressure of all these factors, Napoleon realized that a war is inevitable. He couldn't leave Warsaw as Russia was planning not just an intrusion but a shatter of the duchy, and wanted to raise Prussia to fight against Napoleon and then head to Paris. Russia was deploying its troops not to protect its borders but to go to Paris. This is a difficult thing to get, but it's true. In summer 1811, Napoleon made a decision, most probably in August, as on August the 15th, his birthday, Napoleon had a reception of ambassadors and approached the Russian ambassador Kurakin and spoke to him harshly about Russia's behavior. The emperor said, "It's easy to draw a sword, but hard to put it back." So many perceived the August 15th talk with Kurakin as the pronunciation of war, and so it was. In 1811, Alexander I didn't have the guts for an invasion. On the other hand, in the summer he received reports about Napoleon's serious military preparations, and he began to think of a more interesting strategy, namely to provoke Napoleonic invasion of Russia. The strategy was the following. When the French army steps on the Russian soil, Russia will mobilize its troops, which was hard in case of an offensive, exhaust Napoleon, and then attack the army and go to Paris. In April-May, the final decision was made. The Russian army would not cross the borders, but instead would be waiting for the French to invade. You know, at that time nobody could imagine a future retreat up to Moscow, as an exhaustive campaign was planned near the western provinces of Russia. The French army was expected to bear great losses and retreat, giving Russia a chance to advance and head to Paris. Napoleon, in his turn, was sure that Russians were waiting for him near the border, and in some decrees spoke about a 20-day campaign, that is, a border crossing, a battle at Vilnius, a crushing victory over the First Russian Army and maybe over the Second Army led by Bagration, and finally, a truce.